say you're our client? Sort of, yes. Jack, we're fortunate enough that we're the architects for a project and Jack is our client, so I have to be incredibly nice to her all the time. And Jack is the Director of Conservation and Collection Management at National Galleries of Scotland and a brilliant supporter of the arts in Scotland and thankful for what we're trying to do for the National Galleries. And of course Richard DeMarco is, not really sure how to introduce Richard, but I think we can call him a Renaissance man. I mean, he may not be Leonardo. That's no criticism of Richard, but he is in a way Scotland's Leonardo. He is a Renaissance man. And if you think that, I don't need to tell you about his history and the fact that he's still phenomenally active and vibrant, but you know, if you think that he was one of the founders of the Traverse Theatre in the early 1960s, and you go forward and some of the great innovations in art internationally are down to Richard. He's phenomenally important, respected, much loved figure. So we're greatly honoured that Richard's with us tonight, and I'm sure... Oh, I'm sorry, yes, apologies. I won't repeat it all because that would be boring, but I think we're very honoured that Richard's here this evening, and look forward greatly to the conversation that he will have with Jack. And just in advance of that, I'd like to introduce our good friend Mike Russell.
Thank you for the opportunity to introduce somebody I call my friend, Ricky DeMarco, and I do that consciously because he has been such an inspiration to me and to many others for so long that it is an enormous privilege eventually to be able to call somebody like Ricky your friend. I was trying to think what to say when I was coming down. I was up near Oban today, and I was trying to think what I would say about him. And I wanted to mention three things. One is memory, one is disruption, the third is Europe. And they all tie together in Ricky and what he's done and his personality. And the memory one is really important because we forget things in Scotland. We're very good on history and very bad on memory. And we don't remember the impact that people have. You know, I was giving a lecture in the McEwen Hall some time ago, and I happened to mention to somebody I was with, this is the place, the very famous place, where somebody was wheeled across the organ gallery with no clothes on by Ricky DeMarco. And everybody looked at me in astonishment and thought, he is now fantasizing. But that is true. In 1963, at a very famous drama conference, you set Edinburgh and society alive. Even the provost, who was undoubtedly mentally dead, was enraged by what you did. And he said there was something, the words he used were something sick in head and heart from anybody who can devise such a thing. But it was designed to do the second thing, to interrupt, to say that life isn't easy and art isn't easy and politics certainly isn't easy. You have to keep reminding people they're alive, and you have to keep reminding people to ask questions, and you have to get people concerned and angry and involved. And Ricky has spent much of his life getting people concerned and angry and involved, and particularly angry. A man who, from time to time, the arts establishment has just walked away from. And yet, he's not only still here, he has done the most remarkable things, both as a creator and as an enabler of creators. This is a man whose reputation across Europe is greater than any other living Scottish figure. Of that, there is no doubt at all. And yet we have, in a sense, forgotten because we don't talk about him enough. He doesn't let you forget him, actually. He pokes you regularly to make sure you remember. But that brings me to the third word I wanted to use, which was Europe. I spend all my life now on the issue of Brexit in Europe, and I'm not going to give you a dissertation on it. Well, I will if you want, but later. Oh no, but later perhaps. But you know, Ricky embodies the European spirit, both the vision and the hope of Europe, the hope that arose out of the Second World War particularly, but also the connections that are made in Europe. This little chart here is his world. We've just been talking about it. It is every single connection. But you just have to pluck any part of Europe out. And there is somebody, many people who've worked with him, who have been inspired by him, who he has brought to do things. A group from Sarajevo during the siege of Sarajevo to take part in an opera with Damien Hirst, I seem to remember. There's most extraordinary connections being set up in Europe. There isn't a place in Europe you can go and meet people who are creators and artists who do not know who he is and do not revere him and who remember him, which winds me back to where I started, memory. It is a hugely significant thing to see you in Dunoon. Again, you first came here in 1939. It hasn't changed a great deal. It is fantastic to see you here, and even better to know we're going to listen to you and hear what you've got to say and be part of it, and then see what you've brought us. So I'm delighted to have the chance to be honoured by honouring you, and I look forward to the exhibition and to what you've got to say. And please annoy us, disrupt us, energize us, and keep us going. Thank you.
Here we go. Darling, you go first. I'm so pleased that this is being televised and recorded by my favourite representative of the BBC and Scottish television. He happens to be my cousin. But anyway, he is making an extraordinary film which will record the historic moment when Dundee was not quite as important as Dunoon, because Dundee has been wallowing in this extraordinary idea that has got the, what's it called, V&A, to deal with. But you have something much more important. And Michael was talking about memory. And I have possibly the right to be in conversation with Jacqueline. And I know she works as hard as she possibly can to see the realization of the dream that John McCasl's mother had, that this building would not be demolished. Yes, there was the possibility that this beautiful and extraordinary structure wouldn't exist. And I noticed in your local newspaper that the article on this show ends with noting the fact that the love of a particular son for a particular mother, that is John McCaslin, for his mother, caused this building to be saved. Because she couldn't possibly be denied. Not being the kind of woman she was. But the fact is, I met John watching a Shakespearean play. And he was very proud of his son for causing this play to be in existence. So my memory goes back through all these moments, but it even goes back to persuading artists of the Royal Scottish Academy and artists even more important, who are not academicians, to sail with me.
I was just touching your arm, Richard.
Yes, I'm going to finish in a minute.
We had a plan.
Yes,
we had a plan.
I just want to say that I operate on the miracle of what happens in the instant. I didn't expect Michael to speak about what he spoke about. He spoke about memory. The fact is, I persuaded them to sail as artists, and not the usual type of artist, the landlubber who'd never been to sea. I persuaded them to sail on two important vessels, the Glen Masson and the Glen Tarson. All of you must know the meaning of these words. I said to them, I can't take you seriously unless you seriously where these vessels sail from. And they did actually make art. they were inspired by that journey. But before that, they were actually reminding me that I took the most important voyage of my life when my mother persuaded me to sail, and I was 9. My God, that means I was born in 1930. That means that I would rather be 79 and not, no, sorry, 78 and not 88. But here I am, 88, with that memory of sailing down the Clyde from Largs in the most beautiful, extraordinary landscape that a child could ever experience, the Cowes of Bute. So what is the Cowes of Bute all about? It's about an incredible, magical space that I must insist the artists I meet experience. Because if they don't experience the heartland of Europe.
And I'm going to just ask you to pause, Richard, just for a minute so that we can start the conversation, because you're already racing ahead. We had a plan. Richard and I go back only 3 years, but we meet on a not infrequent basis, and I find conversations, which I hope you'll experience this evening, both challenging, intensely frustrating on occasions, but always invigorating and inspirational. And I think what Richard and I met last week and had a plan for what we were going to do today, and let's just roll back into that and tell us, I was really struck from our conversation last week about that childhood, those formative years, and how this part of Scotland had impressed themselves so much on you. Just take us back through the narrative of your childhood up to that and your experience. We're calling it DeMarco in Dunoon. Just tell us about what DeMarco was in Dunoon.
As an Italo Scot, aged 9, I was warned by my father that the last thing I should be doing was speaking Italian, because it was the language of the enemy. And so I didn't learn Italian the way I should have done. Parlo italiano come un idiota, come un scorsese. So my accent isn't as it should be. But the fact is, I was evacuated to Largs so that I would be safe from experiencing another air raid. And the first air raid I experienced was the first air raid of the war. And the bullets were fired at the bomber were not actually hitting the bomber. They were hitting the sand around from my toes. Thankfully, they didn't rip my flesh, so that I could not have walked away from my beloved shoreline. By the way, I was born under the sign of Cancer the crab. That is between the land and the sea. I've not yet asked Michael when he was born, which month. I've not asked John when he was born, but it's important. The fact is, I had to go to the shoreline because I was making sandcastles. And I ignored the planes. I even ignored them as they flew towards me. I didn't see the Spitfires. And the Spitfire bullets were the bullets that would have killed me, not the German bullets. And I attended the funeral of the 2 young pilots who died. I waved to them. My memory faces 17-year-old, 20-year-old. Why did I go to that funeral? I was the only child at the funeral. 10,000 people lined the streets of Portobello to watch the cortege covered in the swastika. The point is, this was the beginning of my life. And this was a kind of proof that I lived not in a place called Scotland. I was alive in Europe. And of course, when I came here, I arrived just in time to experience the outside blitz. I could see it, the sky covered red. I could see the ships, taking thousands of soldiers to fight in North Africa. I saw this as a war zone. I could see all the convoys coming in. This was at the very heart and center long before the Americans came here with nuclear submarines. I remember that I felt the joy of being alive on board that paddle steamer as it took me and my mother to the Cowes. And what is more, I think you mentioned that Winnie Ewing said, yes, I think I experienced the reality of Scotland when I sailed in the water and I saw the great mountains of Arran. Well, do you know? That also happened to me. And I've lived with the memory and with the inspiration from here all my life. When I discovered that this place, Dunoon, not Dundee, was part of the National Galleries of Scotland, I couldn't believe it. I knew a miracle had happened, and I knew the story would go right back to something extremely important, the only thing that matters in our lives, which is an expression of love. And I found out that was the case. Now, I know that John McCaslin is a key figure in the future of how we consider the business of presenting our generation 100 years from now, 500 years from now, in the form of a new concept of a building. But that building will forever, especially in my heart, be linked to Dunoon, because he is a Dunoon soul, and he was a young soul experiencing in his childhood what I was experiencing in my childhood. And so I have a terrifying responsibility to explain this and why I decided to bring the greatest artist of the 20th century here. I rushed him out of Edinburgh. I said, there's nothing of any importance for you here. You've got to get out. Come with me now.
Because downstairs we have an exhibition with complex strands of thinking. Before we launch into one of the key strands, which you're starting to talk about at the moment, could we just touch on, at age 17, you mentioned last week when we were discussing that seminal moment at the age of 17, the first Edinburgh Festival that you experienced, that moment, what that did for you.
Well, I was about to leave Edinburgh, like most of that young generation. There was nothing happening. It was a grey city, and unfortunately the people who lived on the East Coast didn't have the benefit of living on the West Coast. So you've got to pray for them every day, these poor souls who live with the sun rising and setting in the wrong direction. You know, I mean, it really is unbearable for me. The Firth of Forth can never do what the Firth of Clyde can do for me. And I think the Edinburgh Festival literally became my university. The world's greatest exponents of this language, which is the most dangerous language in the world, the language that has penetrated the souls of generations of the people who come from my village in Italy, because they are all called the children of Cicero. Cicerone is the name. Because Cicero's villa, Michael, you should know this, the Parliament should know this, I know it, but not people in Scotland know it, that Cicero was, as far as I was concerned, perhaps one of the greatest human beings ever lived, because he was a politician and poet. And every time he opened his mouth, that came truth, and therefore beauty, which is the role of the artist. So what I'm saying is, I could have left Edinburgh immediately. I completed my time at Edinburgh College of Art, but I didn't, because I felt, it's very strange this, I felt a kind of embarrassment that all this great wealth of truth and beauty was being given to me. I was listening for the first time in my life to the greatest orchestra in the world. It was the Vienna Philharmonic, which Hitler had destroyed. Nobody could hear it play, and it played in Edinburgh. I was listening to the greatest actors that the French have ever produced in the Comédie Française, performing Molière, but not in English, in French. And I suddenly realized, my God, why was I failing my French exam at school when you know why? Because my French teacher couldn't speak French.
So let me just pull you back round to the event this evening and the exhibition downstairs. I was looking in a publication that came out to celebrate your 80th birthday, and there were a few statements that really captured you. I'll just read them out as quotes, and then we can move on perhaps to how these manifest themselves in the exhibition downstairs that you'll all experience when we go down later. So there's a quote from the 10 Dialogues exhibition. Art begins in the meeting of friends. If DeMarco has a watchword, it is dialogue. It's about that relationship, that conversation that goes on. We're having that this evening. He is driven to change the terms of public discourse about art, society and politics in both post-war and post-Cold War Europe. There's an element of healing, revival and rebirth in the thinking and the artworks that he co-creates with many artists and individuals around the world. That power, that essence of you, Richard, is evident, I would suggest, in the exhibition downstairs, and particularly clear through your friendship with Joseph Beuys and the work you co-created with him, Celtic Kinloch Rannoch, the Scottish Symphony. What I think would be really interesting for people to hear is just a little bit about how you met him, what that meant to both of you, because when we go down into the exhibition, understanding the significance of that piece, I think needs to have that background.
Well, it's very strange. I was with two very important people in the art world, and they, together with me, saw Beuys create a masterpiece. It was at something called Documenta, which makes Castle the place every artist wants to be if they can possibly be invited. Almost as important as the Venice Biennale, not quite, nevertheless, the German version. And I saw something which overwhelmed me. I was with an artist that I represented, and he just won the Biennale Sculpture Prize. My God, the DeMarco Gallery representing the winner of the International Sculpture Prize of the Biennale. And by the way, he wasn't Scottish. He was Colombian. But the point is, he had to be a very good sculptor. I was quite very proud of him. Part of it was, he would have a show in the world's greatest museum, the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. See? Okay? This is the world I belong to. I belong to this world, which is the world which crosses every frontier and makes nonsense of any kind of idea that we are isolated from other countries.
So how did Beuys come into the picture? What was the circumstances?
Well, what happened was he was making an artwork which obviously caused my two companions, one the great artist and the other the director of this thing, we bored out of their minds. We've got to go. We've got to catch the train to Amsterdam. And I saw there was Beuys making this thing, and I couldn't understand it. But you don't have to understand art, because art hits your heart. It overwhelms you. It's like falling in love. you can't explain it. If you've fallen in love, you can't explain why. And so I fell in love with the genius of this man. And I had to wait 2 years until the chance came when the German, sorry, it wasn't the German government, it was the West German government, because Germany was split in two. The West German government said, you must come. A certain woman who was the cultural attaché in London said, you must come and see what's happening in Dusseldorf. And I thought, wait a minute, Boyce lives in Dusseldorf. Oh, and she said, I hope you're not going to choose to put on at the Edinburgh Festival a big exhibition from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I said, don't worry. Of course I wouldn't be so stupid, because I'm not conscious of the fact that New York is in Europe. It's a kind of, it's not quite Europe. It tries to be, especially in New York. You have a feeling that you haven't left Europe. But by the time you get to Los Angeles, you know you're in some kind of fantasy land, Disneyland, whatever. But the fact is, I got the chance to be the guest of the German government. I'd just been the guest of the American government, and I'd been the guest of the Canadian government, and I was doing all this so that I could raise the money to put on a major international program. And I was told, director of the official festival, Richard, you can do it. Oh, do what? You can put on a program of living artists. I agree with your argument. All the actors are alive. All the dancers are alive. But all the visual artists are dead. That we bring to the festival. Picasso, Rembrandt, you name it. Okay, so on one condition, you can have the job. You pay for it.
So with Boyce in the picture, when you're down in the exhibition, there is a wonderful series of photographs, moments captured. But it's capturing an event, an intervention, an activity, a moment that happened many years ago, which carries on living through these images. Can you, to help us really understand what the initiating point was for those images, can you tell us what the experience was with the creation of Scottish Symphony, what that felt like when you were in the middle of co-creating that with Boyce?
Well, Boyce was the co-founder of the Green Party in Germany. We all should be grateful to the Green Party, because it wasn't born here, it was born in Germany. And I was fascinated by the fact that he was deeply involved in German politics. And I was, of course, overwhelmed by his genius. And I knew I couldn't persuade him to come to Scotland, because we had the greatest art world in Europe. I was conscious that Paris, perhaps, Berlin, whatever, Rome, were rather more important. But I said to him, I think I come from a country that you should experience. And I only had a few minutes with him, because there was a whole crowd of people desperate to make contact with him. And all I had in my pocket, deliberately, were postcards of the Clyde, of the Cows of Bute, of heather, purple heather, of long-haired cattle, of all sorts of things which I identified with my childhood, which made me feel I had been blessed. I realized that there was compensation in leaving the village, which was the village of Cicero, the village full of shepherds, because my family were really farmers and shepherds, because there was another mountain range. It wasn't the Apennines, it was the Pennines. And we actually have that mountain landscape, not in the south of England, south of this part of the world, but in what I would define, how can I say, in the mountainous areas where sea lochs, where the sea penetrates the land, the land mass of Europe. Europe ends in an extraordinary frontier between ocean and landmass. You can see it in the clouds. You can see it in the fact that every second there's a different mountain that you're looking at, a different island, a different, how can I say, wave pattern. And I realized that Boyce needed, living as he did in the heartland of Europe, to experience this. And when he told me that his name was Celtic, and he lived in a Celtic enclave, surrounded by a Protestant Nordrhein-Westphalen area. And then I discovered that that part of Germany had been Christianized by Celtic monks from Iona. And they had left their mark in all the place names. Mönchengladbach means the place of the Celtic monks. And his city of Cleves was the same kind of, had the same kind of cultural heritage. So all I had to say was, what do you see? When I showed him maybe about 25 postcards, and the reply was quite overwhelming. I'll never forget it. What do you see, Professor Boyce? And he said, I see the land of Macbeth and his witches. My God. He had, I discovered later, great knowledge of the space between mythology and history, because they come together in the Celtic imagination. And if we're talking about the difference between, if you like, Romanized Europe, thank God, by the way, I've got an Irish great-grandmother, so my blood is not quite Italian, it's Celtic. So I want you to know that I realized that Boyce was already being written about as the 20th century Leonardo da Vinci. There's a scientist, politician, philosopher, thinker, modern times. I was dealing with someone I'd longed to meet, because I realized that the art world, whatever that is a very, very dodgy creation. When you admit that you're an artist, people look at you with that kind of funny look, you know, why are you not doing something serious?
So your friendship with Boyce continued over a number of years. I think, did he come to the UK, to Scotland about 8 times, I think, yes. Or something like that?
More than he ever went anywhere else.
Yes. So when we're in the exhibition downstairs, just tell us a little bit more to help with the understanding of the images that capture the Scottish Symphony piece.
Well, you must understand, I have a camera, a very cheap camera, and like Michael Russell, I use it in a strange way, because I don't take photographs. I'm not interested in taking photographs. You know, expensive camera, getting the thing right and all that kind of stuff, and making the thing look beautiful. I'm not interested in that. My job, because it passes at such a speed, is to contribute another dimension to my encounter with a great human being. I've had the privilege of dealing with at least half a dozen geniuses. I talk about people like Ian Hampton Finlay, or in this country, Hugh McDermott. I talk about in Boyce, I mean, the genius of geniuses. And I realized he was the answer to Andy Warhol, who turned art into money. And art is not about money. Art is about how you express your love. Every soldier in the trenches of the First World War was writing love letters. These letters were nearer to love letters than anything else, to their mothers, to their family, to the beloved person. Because they were at a point of deadly seriousness. It was not for fun that they were there. It was a death. So I thought, my God, if I use the word, the language of art, the way it should be, the way Boyce uses it, it could change society. And I wondered why people were not taking Cicero seriously and not realizing that what is needed in the world of politics is the presence not of the politician, but the statesman, the poet, the leader who expresses love for fellow human beings. I want you to know that I didn't want to be in the art world. I didn't want to be in a world selling art, where art is reduced to a commodity. I make art as Boyce made art, as a way of communicating. I once asked Boyce, tell me, what is the raison d'etre of your art? And he said, my art is my teaching. His art, he never once made an artwork to sell. He made an artwork to express the impossible complexity of his thoughts and as an expression of his need to love, especially as he knew he was dying. For the 16 years that I knew him, I was grateful for every meeting because I could feel that his body had been destroyed. His wounds were agonizing. He couldn't sleep for the pain. Half of his skull had gone, one lung had gone. But mentally, he'd had the biggest breakdown imaginable. For, I think, nearly 3 years, he worked as a farmer to recover. And this man changed, because you don't deal with a genius like you deal with any normal human being. And he said to me, in the last time I met, it was on the phone, 2 weeks before he died, Richard, I'm coming back. Yes, to help you. I'm coming to Scotland. Oh, God, I'd heard he was dying. Please help me. I want to understand the world of Adam Smith. Understand the second book that he wrote about the instinct that human beings have to help others, not the wealth of nations. And I thought, my God, because can I say, he was interested, Boyce being Boyce who he was interested in the idea of art as an expression of creativity, not as something which is immediately $1 million or whatever. So there you have a very interesting challenge to me, because I have created, in all my correspondence with Boyce, in all the photographs I have of him, something so much of a treasure house that I know is of the greatest value to the whole world, because it's proof that he took Scotland seriously as something he needed to express his genius. Because when he was here, he told me he was happier than he was anywhere else. There were two places he was in love with. One was Italy, and one was Scotland.
We have about 3 or 4 minutes left. Just one last area that I think that would be really useful to touch on, or of interest to touch on. When you enter the exhibition, there are these 2 extraordinary logs. They're absolutely wonderful. And Richard, you referred to them as a true Boycean object. Tell us just in a few words about this vision around the planting of the oak trees, the significance of the logs in the exhibition. Just give us an inkling of where that all fits into the big picture.
Well, I've always been curious about how human beings managed to live in the city of the Enlightenment when there was a genius every other yard. They were all there, but they were living in a sordid world. And what made their lives possible was the system of producing water that they could drink and avoid the plague and other illnesses. And the water was coming through the most remarkable pipeline, not made of lead, which they discarded, but was created in the 17th century, 16-something, of wood, of elm wood. And I became amazed that a very good friend of mine, serious artist from Brazil, was the person who presented me with it. Said, this is Boycean. She, in fact, wants to create a new society where the Boycean theory of social sculpture, you know, using art to reshape society. Well, I couldn't believe when she told me that she had acquired 2 precious pieces of this extraordinary pipeline. And you'll see that they survived being elm in this building. They are the most beautiful things. They are objects, and they are all about Edinburgh, and they're all about the world that Adam Smith lived in. So they're intensely Boycean for me, and I don't know what the price is that anyone would put on them, but I do know that Boyce experts would see that they're beyond price. Now, they're the work of one of the artists, but there are other artists, and one of them is somebody you probably have heard of, Michael, Andrew Marr. I interview him because he's an artist, not a politician. So
the idea is we were going to have a Q&A up here, but we felt it might be better to actually have Richard in the exhibition so that some of these points can be explored with the artworks or the photographs and the objects in front of him, because I think it makes it even more tangible to really understand some of these quite nuanced elements of the exhibition. But just quickly, and it does need to be quick, Richard, the planting of the 7,000 oak trees, we must put this in. Tell us a little bit about that.
One of the last things that Boyce asked me to do, I don't know if you've listened to my interview with him, where we talk about the fact that he's the most famous artist in the world. He's given up showing in museums, and he's going to go to Documenta, and he's going to raise the money. And by the way, he did a deal with me. Yeah. He said, Richard, you're not a dealer. You don't deal with art as money. You don't want art to be the same thing as, it's like health, well-being. You can't put a price on it. So he said, I'll tell you what, can you make an agreement with a young chap called Anthony? And there you have the agreement that I would not be responsible for selling his masterworks, because he said, I need a dealer, do you mind? But I will I will remain working with you on whatever it is that we have to do. And one of the things that we have to do, Richard, is plant 7,000 oaks. And in the interview, I say, well, 7 is the sacred number of the Druids. They built their temples in the form of a circle of oak trees. You know, that's why you've got the word Druid in about 600 place names all over Britain, and particularly in Scotland. And the Druids were the people that they were known as having the understanding of the soul of the oak, because the oak is the king of the forest, and under the branches of the oak, every other tree can flourish, the animal, everything can be right, the climate can work. And Richard, can you please devote your life to making sure that, for example, in Scotland, I mean, you couldn't hear him, you couldn't hear his voice saying this in Scotland and everywhere else. Well, I've just been to the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and I've just been heartened by the fact that the director of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, a very famous museum, perhaps the world's most famous museum, has said, with delight I will do that. I've decided to extend, therefore, whatever the Guggenheim is, by planting 7,000 oaks. Now, here, you are covered in trees. In fact, not only do you have trees, you have one of the greatest botanical gardens in the world, at Benmore. So I'm asking you, all of you, to help me fulfill the dream of Boyce. Can I just say...
Stop it there, that's the perfect
No, wait a
ending.
minute.
It's the perfect ending,
The idea was born on Loch Awe. He got the idea.
We're going to stop because the reason, when you're in the exhibition, there's a wonderful image of Boyce of an area of land that is completely stripped clear.
That's right.
So it's a very nice introduction to the exhibition. So, I think that is it.
Richard and Jackie, it was really wonderful, insightful, and I think you'll absolutely love the exhibition. And can also want to say a really big thank you to Terry, who's just been amazing throughout this week in this whole putting all of this together. There's so many people that's worked really hard. So thank you so much. Please make your way down to the gallery, and thank you.
Thank you.
Majestic lines, and so I expect all of you to add your names to this, and I'm hoping that John and his dear wife will add their names. And all I'm saying is that I think history has been made with the creation of this awful building, and I'm going to assure you that I've got a plan to involve the primary school children of this area in Grand Opera, because I would like to think that, in particular, the school, which is the primary school of power, will be performing an opera that they will write and they will perform, they will sing, and this is going to happen with your help.